So my specific focus, as Dr. Livingston said, is South Carolina history, and especially the Confederacy. And when I read the letters and other documents from the antebellum period and earlier in South Carolina, I see a world of the past in which there was much good. The gentleman I'm going to talk to you about today, Frederick Adolphus Porcher, came from this period, and much of his world now lies deep beneath the waters of a vast lake. The countryside in South Carolina in which he was born and raised and spent much of his life lies at the bottom of one of two large man-made lakes that were created in the early 1940s to make way for the Santee Cooper hydroelectric project. A scholar that I know who has deep ancestral roots in this part of South Carolina is writing an extensive history about this area that was flooded over. And Doug Bostick, who spoke here last night, has published a pictorial book about it called Sunken Plantations. Like these sunken plantation lands, many of the truths of our history will lie hidden from view unless we find them and make their value and importance known. Back in April, when Dr. Livingston invited me to speak here at the Abbeville Institute, it so happened that I was working on an article for the South Carolina Historical Magazine about a newly discovered manuscript in our collections that had been found among the papers of Frederick Adolphus Porcher, a South Carolina historian, educator, and author. Porcher is probably not very well known except to students of antebellum intellectual history, but he was quite significant as a historian and an intellectual in Charleston in his day. So I thought it would be a good topic as we explore the intellectual vitality of the Old South in antebellum times and a civilization that was destroyed by aggressive northern sectionalism. Among the most important books published recently about antebellum southern intellectual history are several that were authored by the late British academic Michael O'Brien. He's probably best known for his 2-volume work called Conjectures of Order. In this book and others, O'Brien shows how the antebellum South was in fact an intellectually vibrant culture and not a narrow-minded cultural desert as its detractors have characterized it. To give you a little further descriptions of Brian's book, I'm going to quote briefly from the comments on the cover, which state, quote, "Placing the South into the larger tradition of American and European intellectual history while recovering the contributions of numerous influential thinkers and writers, O'Brien's masterwork demonstrates the sophistication and complexity of Southern intellectual life before 1860, unquote. Frederick Adolphus Porcher appears as a topic in more than one of O'Brien's books, including Intellectual Life in Antebellum Charleston and a collection of essays he edited called All Clever Men Who Make Their Way, Critical Discourse in the Old South. In the latter book, O'Brien includes an essay by Porcher that concerned modern art that was published in the Southern Quarterly Review in 1852. This essay was a critique of a bigger-than-life statue of John C. Calhoun, created by the celebrated sculptor Hiram Powers. It's an interesting piece that deals in part with theories and schools of art, but Porcher did not like Powers' portrayal of Calhoun in a Roman toga and curls, giving his objections to what he termed the bland imitation of antiquity, urging the idea instead of historic truthfulness and faithfulness. To give you just a sample of his essay, I want to read the following quotes. Mr. Powers, following in the wake of other artists, has chosen to be a humble imitator of antiquity, rather than to strike boldly for a work which would identify his name with his age, his country, and his race. Mr. Calhoun is represented after the antique. We cannot conceive how the sculptor can be said to labor with more liberty when he is obliged to clothe his subject like a Roman senator than when the truth of history requires he should be dressed as a Christian. Powers might have made Calhoun the type of the great man of the 19th century. He has preferred to invest him with conventional greatness. If the character, conduct, and services of Mr. Calhoun deserved the meed of a statue, the garb in which he was accustomed to daily appear cannot be otherwise than respectable. Calhoun was a man who will probably live with posterity because he lived with and for his contemporaries. His greatness was the reflection of the moral and intellectual excellence with which he was surrounded. In him they were embodied and concentrated. And such greatness is to be represented by adhering to historical truth. The people of Charleston asked for a statesman and have received a Roman senator. We asked for the citizen of the 19th century and have received a specimen of the antique. We asked for our Calhoun, the Carolina planter, and have received an elaborately carved stone," unquote. A couple of weeks ago, my sister and I went to the newly remodeled Gibbs Museum of Art in Charleston, and in one of the rooms they had some specimens of sculpture, one of which looked like a Roman emperor. I said, "Who is that? I mean, why is that in here?" Because they were usually portraits of South Carolinians. And we finally found the label that went with this sculpture, which was a little difficult to locate at first, and it turned out to be a sculpture of George Washington. You would have never have known that if you hadn't read the label, though, because it looked like a Roman emperor or Heliogabalus or somebody. Anyway, in 2002, Porcher was one of the principal subjects in a book by Charles J. Holden entitled Into the Maelstrom, Conservatives in Post-Civil War South Carolina, published by the University of South Carolina Press. Holden defines Porcher as a conservative, which he certainly was, and explores his thoughts on politics, society, and economics. I don't agree with some of Holden's contentions, but the 2 chapters that he devotes to Porcher are useful as an introduction to the things about which he wrote and thought. Notwithstanding Porcher's view on modern art, Porcher believed in the importance of history and tradition and a hierarchical society as opposed to an egalitarian one. Among other topics, Porcher wrote about education in South Carolina, women in 18th century France, ancient political institutions, sectional differences, the conflict of labor and capital, and Webster's Dictionary. So who was Frederick Adolphus Porcher? As his last name might suggest, he was a descendant of early Huguenot immigrants to South Carolina. He was born on a plantation in the parish of St. John's, Berkeley, which is part of present-day Berkeley County. Now, that's a low-country county, an inland county, which is contiguous to Charleston County, through which the Cooper River flows. Porcher was educated at schools in Charleston and Vermont, and at the age of 19, he graduated from Yale. He became a planter like his father, and though he had a great interest in scientific agriculture, he did not do well as a planter. He served several terms in the South Carolina legislature, and in 1848 he became the professor of belles lettres and history at the College of Charleston. He wrote and published numerous essays dealing with local history and other subjects, many of which were published in Russell's Magazine and other Southern periodicals. In 1855, he became one of the founders of the organization for which I work, the South Carolina Historical Society, and served as its president for many years. He was also very active in the Charleston Library Society. Around 1848, Porcher was, as he described it, elected a member of the Conversation Club, or the Club, as it was fondly called by its members. In his book, Intellectual Life in the American South, 1810 to 1860, Michael O'Brien gave this brief history of the club. In Charleston, in about 1807, was founded the Literary and Philosophical Society of South Carolina, modeled on the American Philosophical Society and its numerous 18th century companions. It lasted till about 1836, when it seems to have lapsed. Of its proceedings there is little evidence, except that it varied between public lectures and papers given in private. Some of these were to find their way into the pages of the Southern Review, some into pamphlets, while others remained unpublished. It was revived informally by Mitchell King in about 1842 and survived until the Civil War, during which time it was known as the Conversation Club, the Charleston Literary Club, or more simply, the Club. Now, there was in the 1850s another group of mostly literary men in Charleston who met at John Russell's bookstore on King Street. Probably the most famous frequenter of this group was William Gilmore Simms. Other members included James L. Pettigrew, Basil Gildersleeve, Henry Timrod, William J. Grayson, William Henry Trescott, and the poet Paul Hamilton Hayne. The monthly periodical called Russell's Magazine, founded by Sims, grew out of these meetings. Frederick Porcher was known to visit this group from time to time, and the two groups also shared a few other members, but Porcher was more often found at the meetings of the Conversation Club, which he wrote about at some length in his memoirs. This is how Porcher described the Conversation Club. This was an association of gentlemen who met weekly at each other's houses for the purpose of conversation upon some subject furnished by the master of the house. This subject was announced at the preceding meeting, and the host opened the club by expressing his views in writing or otherwise. A member appointed by him acted as the moderator, and the members were called upon in order and allowed to give time to give their views. After a paper of about 2 hours, the club adjourned to the dining room, where an elegant but not expensive supper was provided. In Porcher's memoirs, which were published posthumously in the South Carolina Historical Magazine, he gives descriptions and opinions about many of the club's members, their good and bad points and foibles, etc. These are some of the men that he mentioned as members in circa 1850. Mitchell King, an attorney with literary tastes. Patrick Lynch, the Catholic Bishop of Charleston. Daniel Ravenel, a banker and college trustee. Charles Fraser, an artist. Dr. Samuel Gilman, a Unitarian minister. Gilman was a Northerner who Porcher described as a freethinker who believed in human perfectibility. The Reverend John Bachman, a Lutheran minister and naturalist, a collaborator with Audubon, originally from New York, and a strong proponent of the unity of the races. Dr. James Moultrie, a physician and medical professor. Reverend Thomas Smythe, an Irish-born Presbyterian minister and bibliophile. Dr. Thomas Prelo, a physician and medical professor. John McCarter, a bookseller and a native of New Jersey. George S. Bryan, a lawyer. James H. Taylor, a merchant and a native of Connecticut. William James Rivers, a historian and a professor. Nathaniel Russell Middleton, president of the College of Charleston. And the Reverend W.C. Tustin, a Baptist minister and an agent of a Baptist newspaper. So in both groups, the Conversation Club as well as the Russell's Bookstore group, we find a rather diverse set of men in terms of profession, religion, and politics. James L. Pettigrew, for instance, was a well-known Unionist, while many other members of the Russell Bookstore were secessionists. Porcher does not give a great deal of information about the topics that were discussed at the meetings of the club, but he does mention a few. One topic was art, another Plato, and another, which was probably occasioned by a visit from Louis Agassiz of Harvard University, was the origin of the human races. Agassiz, one of the most famous scientists in the world at the time, theorized that the races came from separate origins, that is, separate creations. This was a theory called polygenesis or polygenism. At least two members of the Conversation Club, the Reverend John Bachman and the Reverend Thomas Smythe, probably gave Agassiz some lively debate on this subject. These clergymen were strong proponents of a single creation, as described in Genesis, and the unity of the human race as descendants of Adam and Eve. Bachman and Smythe both published books in 1850 upholding the unity of the races. And Frederick Porcher liked Dr. Smythe, but he felt that the clergyman was not so learned as he believed himself to be, and had a too superficial knowledge of some subjects. So this is a little anecdote that Porcher gave about Smythe. When Charleston was exhausted by the discussion of the unity of the races, Dr. Smythe took the side of unity and undertook to convert Agassiz, who opposed the unity doctrine on physiological and anatomical principles. Feeling the necessity of some knowledge on this subject in order to meet the great naturalist in that field, Smythe actually went to the dissecting rooms of the medical college one day to witness the operations of the pupils, and now fancied himself able to compete with Agassiz on his own ground. These were the little follies of his at which we used to amuse ourselves, but they did not weaken the kind regard we had for the amiable Dr. Smythe. I also mentioned that Dr. Samuel Gilman of Massachusetts, a free-thinking Unitarian minister, was also a member of the club, and Pesce described Gilman in this way: "I think he was more or less a convert to every new extravagance that from time to time disturbed the New England mind. He believed in the perfectibility of humanity. There was no limit, in his opinion, to the development of both the moral and intellectual powers, and he had certain undefined notions that by properly cultivating the physical character of the race, it could be so improved that we would even surpass the purity and excellence of our original parents," unquote. In his book, Conjectures of Order, Michael O'Brien devotes many pages to the Conversation Club, so if you're interested in knowing more about it, I recommend that book. And he begins by pointing out that there were many such groups in America in the 19th century. In Boston, for example, Ralph Waldo Emerson and friends founded the Transcendental Club to discuss the ramifications of that philosophy. Through extensive research, O'Brien was able to put together a list of topics that were discussed at the Charleston Club. Topics were various, O'Brien wrote: political, moral, economic, and historical. Pesce observed that the club avoided religion and politics, though, judging from what is known of their topics, by this he seems to have meant partisanship and sectarianism. Among the many topics enumerated by O'Brien were phrenology, slavery, scientific agriculture, the sources of South Carolina history, immigration, the education of slaves, John Randolph, the history of the Southern states, Milton, women's rights, specific literary works such as Grayson's The Hireling and the Slave, secession, and the commerce of Charleston. After describing a number of men who took part in the Conversation Club, Pesce closed his post-war memoir in this way: "These names embraced most of those who, during 10 years, were either all the time or part of it members of the club. Of course, there was no obligation to attend, and sometimes we would not have more than 5 or 6 members, while at others I have seen more than 40 persons present. We almost always had visitors, either residents of the city or strangers. When Mr. Agassiz was here, he was as regular in his attendance as any member. The same may be said of the Reverend Orville Dewey. Few visitors of distinction ever visited the city who were not given free entry of the club, and if we had strangers who honored us with their presence, we would sometimes have others with whom we were ashamed to entertain. It was an excellent social institution, and I believe none of its members fail to remember it with affectionate regard. The war broke it up. Since the restoration of peace, the shattered fortunes of the surviving members have not permitted them to indulge in even the small extravagance which a club supper would occasion, and the club lives now only in the memories of its members, a pleasant thing to remember and an amiable feature in the social history of Charleston," unquote. The papers of Frederick Adolphus Pesce are found in 2 main repositories, the South Carolina Historical Society and the Special Collections of the College of Charleston, where he taught for many years. In his papers at the former, a researcher recently came across a manuscript which until now had been overlooked and, of course, never published. It was part of an essay that Pesce penned in 1868. Like some of his published writings, it concerns the social and cultural life of the planters of St. John's, Berkeley Parish, but it also deals with the subject of slavery and also describes wartime events of the 1860s in that part of the Low Country. This is a paper which I am editing for publication in the South Carolina Historical Magazine. As far as slavery went, Pesce had defended the peculiar institution in writings published before the war. But apparently in the 1850s, he had begun to hear, as he described it, in the distance the tocsin which was sounding the death of slavery. During the war, when the survival of the Confederacy was looking doubtful, Pesce advocated arming the slaves in its defense and promising them freedom for their military service. He wrote to his old friend Judah P. Benjamin, then the Confederate Secretary of State, urging him to implement this policy as soon as possible, and broadly outlining a plan of emancipation guided by white men for the change from slavery to freedom. Although Porcher's section on the institution of slavery in this unpublished essay is in some degree a defense, it is primarily an analysis, and he weighs and examines its failings and benefits in the economic and social spheres as one intimately acquainted with it. After describing some of the ill effects of slavery on commerce, progress, and general prosperity, he views the institution under its moral aspect, allowing that it is immoral, quote, to subject a man to the absolute control of another, unquote, but then arguing it is not slavery alone which confers absolute power. It is the attribute of wealth under every form of society. Porcher admits that in the annals of slavery, the annals of slavery would, if brought to light, reveal a long and fearful record of crime, brutal violence, and licentiousness, but also points out that when these crimes are found among slaveholders, they are charged directly against the system. When they are found elsewhere, they are ascribed to the inherent sinfulness of humanity. In other words, as he states later on, these crimes are not peculiar to slavery. Enslaved persons are subject to the same evils as any other class of human beings, not because they are slaves, but because they are human beings. Porcher maintained that humanity and not brutality was the rule of the planter's conduct, though this may not have been due so much to virtue as self-interest, which operated as a check against the abuse of absolute power. Porcher also devotes a few paragraphs to Harriet Beecher Stowe and a dismissive critique of her Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Key that she subsequently published, containing a record of fearful crimes committed by slaveholders. This Key, Porcher contends, contained nothing new. No one denied that slaveholders had committed crimes, and had Mrs. Stowe pushed her inquiries a little further, she would have discovered that the slaveholders she condemned had already been condemned by their neighbors, having been, quote, put to the ban of society at their homes for the very crimes she gloats over in her Key, unquote. Porcher then goes on to argue that anyone who is in the power of another person is, in effect, a slave, stating, if men must be mutually dependent upon each other, it matters little to the weak whether the name of his condition is freedom or slavery, for his freedom is but a name. Is that Janis Joplin said that or something? He goes into other aspects of the institution and concludes his lengthy remarks on the topic by declaring, quote, I have lived in the slave states and in free states, and I have never known a society which entertained a higher tone of honor, a more deeply rooted moral and religious principle than were to be found in the society of slaveholders who form the subject of this sketch, unquote. This defense of his own culture leads into a narration of wartime events in St. John's, Berkeley Parish and the neighboring areas. But before I give you details about that, I want to touch on Porcher's life in Charleston during the war. His correspondence at the South Carolina Historical Society has some letters which shed some light on these activities during the war years. His family left Charleston to reside in Laurens, South Carolina. But like most of the college faculty, he remained in the city and continued his duties as a professor, even though the student body was much reduced in numbers, of course, eventually to only a handful. When the war began, he was about 52 years old. His letters to his wife are full of news of the war in Charleston and elsewhere, and offer a few details about the part that Porcher was playing as a member of Company E, 1st Charleston Reserves, under the command of Captain Henry D. Lassane. It's unclear from his letters exactly when he joined this unit or how long he served in it, but the Charleston Reserves were called upon to guard the city after the Great Fire in December 1861, and were later placed on provost duty in the city. In the summer of 1862, they were garrisoned at the Charleston Arsenal and also guarded the city's communications and jail. The college campus was, for the most part, out of normal range of the Federal artillery, which began bombarding the city in August 1863. But many parts of the city were under continual threat after that, so his service in the Charleston Reserves was not without some danger. The war brought many personal sorrows to Porcher. He lost a number of friends and relations serving in the Confederate Army, and in 1862, while his wife and daughters were living in Lawrence, his youngest daughter became ill and passed away on July 15th. She was only about 8 years old. His 2 sons survived the war, but both passed away within a little over a year after its end, undoubtedly from causes related to the hardships of their military service. Porcher's eldest son, Edward Gow Porcher, served in the Army as a surgeon, spending the last 2 years of the war on duty with the 32nd Georgia Infantry Regiment. He died at Abbeville, South Carolina, in October 1865. In his memoirs, Porcher marked his eldest son's death with this poignant lament. He lived 26 years and died, leaving me in the midst of a struggle for the daily bread of my family. In 1862, Edward's young brother, Frederick George Porcher, enlisted at age 18 in the 2nd Military District of South Carolina and spent most of his service in his home state. He was debilitated by wounds and illness and passed away in June 1866. His name is among those appearing on the tablet in St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Charleston, memorializing the members who died in Confederate service. Porcher prefaces his narrative about wartime events in St. John's Parish and the neighboring eras with an assertion that it was the superior character of Southerners which had excited the hatred of the Northern people, a hatred that ultimately caused the North to initiate and wage a war characterized by extreme, even genocidal brutality. They felt that in the great moral power of truthfulness and devotion to principle, we were their superiors. Hence, they hated us. They forced us into war, Porcher stated. And then he recounts how some of the brutality of that war was carried out in his part of South Carolina, beginning with events that transpired at a place called Otranto Plantation in February 1865. Some 2 months before General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, General William T. Sherman's army was moving through South Carolina. In mid-February 1865, Confederate forces evacuated Charleston, and the city and the surrounding countryside were left defenseless. Occupying Federal forces conducted raids in the surrounding areas, and troops led by Generals Edward E. Potter and Alfred S. Hartwell operated in the St. James Goose Creek Parish and neighboring parishes of Berkeley County. On February 22nd, a detachment from General Potter's command, which included United States colored troops as well as white soldiers, arrived at Otranto Plantation, the home of Porcher's cousin, Philip Johnston Porcher, whose wife Louise was the sister of James Lewis Pettigrew. Frederick A. Porcher quotes at length from a dramatic letter written by his cousin Marion Johnston Porcher describing the terror and plight of the defenseless women there and the wanton destruction of their food and livestock. And this is what Marion wrote about the invasion that day. The first comer, Lieutenant R., was very insolent. He smirked, sneered, and jeered. His first question was, "Where's the man of the house?" We answered, "He is not here." He then said, "In the rebel army, I suppose." We answered nothing. He seemed unwilling to leave and said, "I suppose you have never seen black troops. You will soon have that pleasure, as they are coming up now." Mamma answered, "I am accustomed to Negroes and have never feared them. Negroes have always behaved well to me." We now saw them advancing up the avenue. They were headed by a little white officer, Lieutenant J., a youth of about 21 or thereabouts, who seemed in a fierce excitement. He screamed to Mamma, "Madam, I have come to liberate your people." Mamma replied, "I hope you will be kind to them. They are accustomed to consideration." This seemed to infuriate the little man, who shrieked, "That is a strange thing for a Southern woman to say to an officer of black troops." All our stock, horses, and mules were driven off. Our cattle, sheep, and hogs were killed. The barns and the smokehouse were broken open and all their contents scattered, and all our vehicles of every kind, tools and implements, were broken in pieces and thrown into the creek or burned. It was awful to hear the screams of cattle and hogs as they were chased and bayoneted, and the scatter and terror of the sheep was terrible to see. Mamma said to Lieutenant J., who was looking with apparent pleasure at the scene of destruction, "If you deprive us of all means of subsistence, we will starve." He turned and said to her, "You are now suffering for what you have done." Then, turning to the house servants who had gathered around us, he called Quash and said, "Uncle, follow me." Quash said, "Yes, massa," at which the little man exclaimed, "For God's sakes, don't call me massa." He then summoned Fanny, Amy, and Rachel, the housemaids, and said, "That woman," meaning Mamma, "is very wicked. I know she has hid things, and you must show me where they are. The rebel man has gone to the wars, but he has left a damned rebel of a woman, and I want her head. Now show me everything." The maids protested that Miss was not wicked. While this was transpiring upstairs, Annie and I were alone on the piazza, facing a great crowd that surrounded the house and filled the whole yard and lawn. Indeed, the scene of confusion was terrific. We saw an indiscriminate crowd of black and white with pointed bayonets come rushing towards the house, evidently with the intention of entering. Now, Marion's letter ends there in Pichet's essay, but we have the original at the House of South Carolina Historical Society, and it goes on from there. But fortunately, at this point, General Potter arrived and decided to temporarily use the Pichet home as his headquarters, thus sparing the ladies from the invasion that they were fearing. Porcher continued his sketch of wartime events, describing the fate of the village of Pineville, the cruel treatment of elderly planters, and the destructive and menacing actions of the freedmen, whom he believed had been goaded into violence by the enemy army. Arms and ammunitions had been freely distributed among the Negroes, Porcher wrote, and then asserted that the arms were meant to be used against the defenseless white residents, since, during February and most of March 1865, there was, quote, "not at that time a Confederate soldier within the limits of Charleston district, scarcely a man capable of bearing arms," unquote. Porcher believed that the Union military and government authorities were hoping that the freedmen would massacre the whites. In fact, he began this section about the war by stating, quote, "I have to show how the people of this district were made to suffer by those agents of the radical power who vainly tried by every hellish device to involve the whole white population of the South in one indiscriminate massacre," unquote. Earlier in the war, in a letter dated July 30th, 1862, Porcher had written to his wife, quote, "Appearances in the Yankee army indicate that the war is rapidly becoming on their side a war of extermination. In fact, the Herald indicates that after the war, there will be splendid fields in Tennessee and elsewhere inviting immigrants from Europe. These fields can become vacant only through the extermination of the present occupants," unquote. Porcher was referring to an article he had likely read in the New York Herald newspaper. But such sentiments, atrocious and barbaric as they were, had been expressed in other northern publications and venues throughout the war and before. As early as May 24th, 1861, an editorial in the Daily Herald, a newspaper in Newburyport, Massachusetts, stated the following, quote, "If it were necessary, we could clear off the 1,000 millions of square miles of the South so that not a city or a cultivated field would remain. We could exterminate 9 millions of white people and repeople the lands." The unpublished essay by Porcher, from which I've been quoting, was meant to be a second chapter to his work entitled The Upper Beat of St. John's, Berkeley, which was published posthumously in 1906 in a journal called The Transactions of the Huguenot Society of South Carolina. Years after his death, Porcher's daughters prepared the manuscript for publication, but chose to leave out this second chapter, which I am preparing for publication. I wondered if they omitted it because of the bitter and indignant sentiments that their father expressed in it, but I don't know for sure. After seeing his country subjugated and his state and a way of life devastated by Sherman's troops and other federal forces, he was certainly entitled to bitterness and indignation. In January 1865, a month before Sherman's invasion of South Carolina, Porcher visited his home parish and wrote the following. "In January 1865, I visited this parish. Though all the planters had contributed liberally with their wealth and their lives to the support of the war, abundance smiled everywhere, and he who had left the beleaguered city almost forgot it forgot when he got to St. John's that war was desolating the fairest portions of the land. If he went to church, he missed the forms of the young men, and perhaps he experienced in the homes of the people a lack of some superfluous luxury of foreign growth, which he had been accustomed to find. But everywhere were order, abundance, and content. And no one could but feel that if the other portions of the Confederacy were but half as well provided, we might brave the brunt of war for years. Now, after the war, powerful agencies are at work. A revolution has passed over us. The prosperity of the country has been destroyed, and the effects of party misrule are paralyzing industry. No one can imagine what will be the condition of things 10 years hence. In February 1865, the Confederate Army left all its strongholds on the coast and crossed the Santee River. Before the month ended, there ensued scenes of devastation, outrage, and barbarism, which were enacted by the party of great moral ideas upon defenseless women and aged men who, trusting that the war was conducted upon principles of civilization, remained at their homes, unquote. The war, of course, was not conducted on principles of civilization by the Northern Army, especially in South Carolina. The orders that were issued by General William T. Sherman concerning the destruction of civilian property were seldom obeyed by his troops. On paper, only unoccupied houses were allowed to be destroyed, but these orders were often violated. One of Sherman's officers, General Alpheus S. Williams, observed at the time, quote, "Orders to respect houses and private property not necessary for subsistence of the army were not greatly heeded, indeed, not heeded at all," unquote. Before houses were burned, Sherman's soldiers would usually loot them of all valuables that could be carried off. After the war, like so many other Southerners, Porcher struggled to provide for himself and his family. In his memoirs, he noted that the war broke up the Conversation Club in Charleston, but he did continue to write and teach, and in 1875 he was principally responsible for the revival of the South Carolina Historical Society, serving as its president until his death in 1888. He worked on his memoirs, which were published after his death, but he also had other writings published in his lifetime, including an article in DeBow's Review in 1870 entitled "The Physical Characteristics and Resources of South Carolina," as well as a history of Reconstruction in South Carolina, which appeared in the Southern Historical Society papers in 1884 and 1885. Men like Frederick Adolphus Porcher were representative of an honorable and intellectually vibrant culture. To me, it is tragic to think of the potential of all the Southern men who perished in a ruthless and unnecessary war that wiped out his civilization. So I'm going to close today by giving you an excerpt from a posthumous tribute that was paid to him by the Historical Society shortly after his death and published in their papers in 1889. It read, "His elevation of mind and thought will best appear from his own noble words, which apply perfectly to himself, and with which this imperfect tribute may be appropriately concluded." And here they quote something that Porcher wrote or said. "He who from the restless activity of his own thought endeavors to pierce into the obscurity which envelops human wisdom is the friend, not the enemy of his race. If there is anything on earth which is absolutely good, it must be truth. Emanating as our spirits do from the source of all truth, surely every process which preserves our souls from error, which disturbs and dispels the cloud that hovers about our intellectual vision, must lead us forward, nearer to the author of our being, and bringing us nearer to him, must infuse into our souls a more perfect sentiment of happiness. The truth is to free our souls from bondage. Surely then, he who earnestly seeks after her must be considered friendly to the best interests of humanity." Thank you.